Hey, listen, by the time you hear this, if you're listening to it when it drops, I want to remind you that the submission deadline for issue 3 of the audio magazine is November 1st. So that is most likely today, depending on when you listen to this. So what does that mean? Themes, heroes, essays must be no more than 2,000 words. Bear in mind, it's an audio essay. So we're always paying attention to how the words roll out of your mouth. Don't think of flowery purple prose. You want things that are easy to say. Email your submissions with heroes in the subject line to creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com. I also pay writers too. Dig it.
Sayward and I talked about this so many times as we worked on this story. It's just amazing to us that Herman Mark's story has not been told before.
And she was like, oh yeah, Uncle Herman. Everyone was afraid of Uncle Herman.
Yo, this is a creative nonfiction podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Meara. How's it going? It's at Brendan O'Meara on Twitter, at CNF Pod on Twitter, at Creative Nonfiction Podcast on Instagram. I don't do meta. It's all gross. Social media is disgusting, and I want to burn it all to the ground and unplug my brain from the matrix, but I can't. Head over to BrendanO'Meara.com for show notes and to sign up for my up to 11 newsletter, first of the month, no spam, can't beat it. And magazine.atavist.com is where you'll find that blockbuster journalism that my best friends over at the Atavist are doing. We need to pay for stuff, man. I can't think of a better magazine subscription for the value you get than Atavist. And get this, I don't get any kickback, so you know I mean business, CNFers. And what does this all mean? It is the Atavistian time of the month, that bonus podcast that's going to hit your feed when you're like, come on, man, just stop it. Will you stop it already? But no, I won't. Tony Perrottet is this month's Atavist showcase. Tony is an international man of mystery. He's Australian-born with a French surname and the author of 6 books, his latest being Cuba Libre, which segues nicely into this piece for the Atavist about Herman Marx, the Butcher, El Carnicero, a Midwest misfit who became the chief executioner for Fidel Castro and Che Guevara during the Cuban Revolution. How do people stumble across these stories, man? I have no idea. There is so much out there. If you don't have any story ideas, you're not looking hard enough. Fact is, there's just, go under that rock. There's a rock over there. There's something in there, man. Under that rock. Maybe in the rock, too, if you're one of those geology nerds. No hate for geologists. It's actually pretty fascinating stuff. But before we get to that, I hope those of you who subscribe and read The Atavist have been enjoying these interviews. And up to this point, I've been more or less tiptoeing around the stories so as not to spoil them. So almost getting at the periphery of them. But going forward, and certainly starting with this one, I'm conducting the interviews on the assumption that you've read the piece and want a deeper dive into the bones. So, spoiler alerts. And if you subscribe to this wherever you get your podcast, and you just put it in your pocket, tuck it right back there, away from your pocket protector, or next to or in your pocket protector so it doesn't leak CNF and goodness on that new shirt of yours. Or that blouse. Do blouses even have breast pockets? I don't know. So yes, going forward, I won't be shy about revealing telling details in the interview. You'd never listen to DVD commentary before you watch the feature film, right? Unless you're some weirdo. But consider these Atavistian podcasts the DVD commentary. Ew, who watches DVDs anymore? Shut up. Not the point. So you can glean that extra little bit of juice from the incredible piece you just read, okay? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to really make that a concerted effort. If you like what we're doing here at CNF Pod HQ and you want to put your money where your ears are, weird, head over to patreon.com/CNFpod. Those dollar bills help subsidize the hosting, the transcripts, and I pay writers who are selected for the audio magazine. There's a few tiers there. Do a little window shopping. See what strikes your fancy. There's a scene in Robin Hood Men in Tights where Cary Elwes, is that his name? from Princess Bride fame, whatever. He throws shade at Kevin Costner, where he says, unlike other Robin Hoods, I can speak with an English accent. In that vein, unlike other literary journals, I pay writers. I call it that fat burrito money because right now, you can maybe take your kid out to a nice afternoon at Chipotle. Just hold the guac. I'm not McSweeney's. All right. So as we start this bonus podcast, we're going to start it with a little jam sesh with Jonah Ogles, the lead editor of this piece. So let's do it. Let's hit it. Let's get into it. Riff. Wild. This was quite a trip. I mean, what did you make of this as you were starting to dive into it?
Yeah, well, I mean, Sayward and I talked about this so many times as we worked on this story. It's just amazing to us that Herman Mark's story has not been told before. Because it's so unbelievable just from start to finish, basically. And, so I was sort of in constant awe that this one individual had such an incredible life, not necessarily in a good way. He's a pretty shady character, and maybe even just a bad human being, but his story and the things that he went through and that happened to him are just a little bit unbelievable,
So this story is broken up into five parts, 5 chapters with an epilogue. So take me through some of the structure and how you guys went about organizing this piece.
Yeah, well, this was one of those stories where you could basically let it tell itself. You just sort of get out of the way and let the facts and the events as they transpired carry the story. So we did want to open with sort of some table setting, and giving people a glimpse into what the Cuban Revolution was at that time, where Castro wasn't really tight with the Soviets yet. He wasn't, though they were around, it wasn't exactly clear what sort of government he might be forming, other than it was, a little bit more populist than Batista's regime. So we talked about many ways of opening the story. We talked about starting with an execution. We talked about starting maybe just at the beginning of Herman Marx's life. But we liked this particular scene where there are a lot of writers around because, well, for a few reasons. First of all, it's sort of just fun for writers and editors to imagine, all these great writers, George Plimpton and Tennessee Williams, hanging out together. But also it sort of, it tells readers that basically this was a scene. A lot of different people were attracted to Castro and the revolution in Cuba in that moment. And that becomes important later in the story when Marx, suffers repercussions because of his involvement. And it was a nice way to tell readers this guy may not have seen it coming. I certainly, Marx deserves, I think, a lot of the bad stuff that comes to him, particularly on the criminal front. But his involvement in the Cuban Revolution was not necessarily like a cut and dried thing, the way, someone who's not familiar with it, like me at the start of the piece, might immediately assume.
And what did Tony specifically bring to this piece and imbue upon the piece with his experience as a historian and journalist?
Yeah, well, he just knows it so well, which is really helpful. He has a book, Cuba Libre, about the Cuban Revolution. So this was clearly, even from the moment he pitched it, it was clear that this was a story that may not necessarily have been a book in and of itself, but clearly needed more than just a mention in a book or even a chapter in a book, and needed a good number of words in order to fully explore this one person's life and the things that he did and that happened to him.
And I always love when I get to talk to you and Sayward about the puzzle of cracking the code of a piece, and sometimes what it takes to, to break it open and put it back together, and and solve the inherent puzzle that is writing a long narrative. So did this piece introduce to you that particular struggle at any point over the course of your editing it and Tony writing it?
Well, it was really the beginning that we wrestled with the most. The rest of it was really a matter of figuring out sort of the right ratios, which is not uncommon, and I may have even talked about that in the past with you. Tony, because he knows this so well, this entire Cuba, a country, this moment in history, the revolution, he knows so much about all of that, and so the initial drafts had much more in-depth conversations about politics or economics, and sort of the international relations. And I think what Tony and I spent the most time doing in our back and forth was just sort of getting those things to the right length so that they informed the reader and gave the reader the necessary context to understand what was happening. But mostly, Tony and I were both just focused on letting the plot drive the thing, because it's so sort of head-scratchingly unbelievable that we never wanted to stray too far from the plot because it's so propulsive. I think it's one of the faster pieces, and just in terms of how it reads, that I've edited recently, and we wanted that. We really wanted that feeling for readers, that they were just being driven forward by the events.
And you talk about ratios and trying to get the right degree of balance between, the action and scene, exposition, and so forth. A lot of people have their way of making sure that they are on balance. And I wonder if you have any tips or tricks or just what you use to assure that you are striking the right balance when you're, editing and synthesizing a piece.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big plot guy. I like plot, and I like a story to be animated by that plot. So, one of the things I will sometimes do when I have a long section that I think should be shorter is I will just, basically write, is like an own exercise for myself, write the section cold, without looking at it. I will just read it and think, okay, now what do I need readers to know? And then I will write, whatever it is, a paragraph, 2, 3, and then reread it, the old paragraphs, and see if I had missed anything important. So for me, that's sort of my guiding principle, which I'm sure some writers are now listening to this and going like, oh crap, don't work with Jonah. But it's a nice way to just distill it to what I think of as its purest form, just the necessary parts. And I always tell readers, including Tony, like, look, if I missed something important, by all means, let's add it back in. And he did that in a handful of cases, and he's right, as writers usually are when they do that. But for me, it's really about just getting it to almost as brief as it can possibly be so that it's not in the way.
And the story takes a really interesting turn from this brutal saga of following Marx, but then as it goes into the courts about U.S. civil rights and citizenship. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because that really takes a really great turn. Yeah,
and I think this is a story we probably would have assigned even without the legal drama that Marx eventually found himself in, but it is what takes it from sort of like a really good story to a great story, because what basically happens is, while Marx is in Cuba serving as the executioner and a soldier in the Cuban Revolutionary Army, he is informed that the State Department has revoked his citizenship. They have denationalized him. And this comes as a total surprise to him that this is even a thing that can be done, because as he says in a press conference, he was born an American, and it's not something that he plans on giving up if he has any say in it. And so what happens is, though this guy is like, a really dark character and it has been putting, hundreds of men to death in Cuba, the ACLU ultimately takes up his case because they want to ensure, sort of Mark's, humanity aside, they want to ensure that the United States government is not able to punish citizens that they deem problematic or undesirable with revoking citizenship. And they're sort of tackling it on two fronts, both for Americans who would be denationalized and for immigrants who became naturalized citizens, but then the government decides they don't like them. Like Emma Goldman, for example, was someone that they used that tool against. So it becomes this hugely important thing. And Marx is really just sort of the vehicle for the ACLU mounting this legal challenge.
Well, it's an incredible story, and I'm going to bring in Tony momentarily to talk a lot more about it. So, Jonah, thanks so much for hopping on and giving a little inside baseball, and we're going to turn it over to Tony in just a moment.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Brendan.
I love getting an editor's take on these pieces because they have a slightly more detached view on the thing, a constructive distance, if that makes any sense. The writers are often in the mud of these pieces for months, if not years, and Jonah and Sayward have a clinically passionate approach to everything they do, which is kind of oxymoronic, but it's a great ballast to the writer's more obsessive dive on a subject. So before we get to Tony Perrottet, let me say that if you want to get in shape, you hire a personal trainer. Not because you don't know how to exercise or eat right, you know all the fundamentals, but because they'll keep you on pace, accountable, watch your form, etc. And if your essays or a book proposal or manuscript need an extra or a similar amount of attention, I'd love to help. My main areas of expertise are sports books and memoir, so if you or someone you know needs someone who can see what you can't see anymore, shoot me an email, brendan@brendanamaro.com, and we'll start a dialogue, okay? All right, it's Tony time. You can find him on Twitter and Instagram at Tony Perrottet, and that Perrottet is spelled Perrottet. And I start off by asking him how on earth he came across Herman Marx, the man at the center of this incredible story.
Well, I did this book on the revolution, the Cuban Revolution, Cuba Libre, and that was came out a couple of years ago. And while I researched it, I was fascinated by how, one of the themes of the book really is how popular the revolution was in the United States and how romantic it seemed. And everyone thought Che and Fidel were these young, sexy, hot, bearded dudes, and they were hanging around with the guerrilla girls were all sexy with gun toting, and the whole thing was just, everyone loved it. And so there are a number of Americans who decided to go down and join up and help fight as guerrillas. And the State Department thought there was 25 or so who sort of joined at various times. One is kind of, became somewhat famous, William Morgan. Because he became involved in defeating a coup against Fidel later in 1961. This other guy, it was just a footnote that I saw in John Lee Anderson's biography of Che Guevara, Che, Revolutionary Life. There's this footnote about this dude who, Herman Marx, who said he was a Korean War veteran, had signed up. And and Che, and then I went back to Che's war diaries, and he talks a bit about this character who was very good with weapons and just arrived and had no real history, just came out of nowhere. But then at a certain point he got wounded and he was sent back to the United States. That it was bad publicity to have Americans dying on the revolutionary side. And Che privately noting that that they're all a little bit. He didn't quite fit in. This guy Herman Marx was a bit of an oddball. Didn't quite fit in, and people found that he volunteered a little too quickly to do the executions when there were sort of revolutionary trials there, and just this sort of stray little reference. But I had always thought it was kind of fascinating, and had wanted to write something about it, but I never really had time to do the research. It was very time consuming to go digging back. During the pandemic, in fact, I was sort of had all this spare time on my hands all of a sudden, which allowed me to do the Freedom of Information Act research and a lot of newspaper research, which was now thankfully online. And I discovered a lot more about him, and that he had and this extraordinary story that he turned up in Havana after the victory, and was appointed to run the executions in Havana for Che and Fidel, which was, of course, the most controversial element of the early revolution. It was this hugely popular thing in the United States, but then it was the first sort of discordant note where people were like, "Hang on, what's going on here?" They're shooting all these. The war criminals, they call them. They're like Batista, dictatorship, sinister figures. No one had much sympathy for them, and yet it was starting to get, it seemed to be spinning a little bit out of control. So not only that, I did a bit more digging, and just like New York Times research, really, just like looking up his name everywhere. And it's like, it turned out he'd been running the executions for a while, and then he fled by hijacking a boat from the Isle of Pines. With his girlfriend from Manhattan, this model, and it was like this extraordinary story. And then he sneaks into the United States, but then even more, he gets arrested in the United States, and he becomes this sort of weird civil rights hero because they'd stripped him of his citizenship, and the ACLU came to defend him. And it's like, and he's on the front page of the New York Times, and no one knew any of this. And it's just literally by just like, reading the newspapers of the time. And it's like he'd become this extremely famous and bizarre figure. So I just found this is one of these extraordinary forgotten lives. And so I became sort of obsessed with it.
Yeah. So what direction did Herman take your reporting, and how did you get your head around all the information that you were able to find on him, given that there wasn't a whole lot of attention given to him really until you kind of unearthed the guy's wild and crazy biography?
Yeah, I was sort of really digging around. Like I went onto Ancestry.com, like finding out where his relatives were and whatever, and then finding one of his nieces, Penlow, who still lives. He came from Milwaukee. He was sort of this Polish American hardscrabble, miserable sort of childhood. But the family is still there, and this niece, Penlow, who I called, found the phone number and called her up. And she was like, "Oh yeah, Uncle Herman." Everyone was afraid of Uncle Herman, and her parents wouldn't let her go anywhere near it. When he came to visit, he wasn't even allowed on the lawn because he was this sort of very strange figure. And then and then I was able to dig up his, because what happened when he was in Havana, he was sort of like, he told everyone that he was like a Korean War veteran, and that he'd sort of like was just a gun enthusiast as a kid and doing all this stuff. And then it came out that he was actually an ex-con who'd been arrested 32 times in 10 states across the United States, from Hawaii to Maine. It was like, he was even arrested once in Australia, where I'm from. It was kind of like when he was in the Merchant Marines. And so he turned out to be this low-level hood, this sort of like, in and out of reform school, just one, screwed up sort of incident after the next, usually drunk and disorderly or just sort of vagrancy or like stealing a car. At one stage, he robs some poor woman, and it turns out he gets like 28 cents worth of mothballs, and he's arrested and he goes to prison for 6 months. So he's a total screw up. He's like this. He's like to me, and yet, I mean, this is a slightly different point, but he's sort of not a terribly sympathetic character in some ways, and yet you sort of like see him as sort of I started to see him like as this film noir sort of figure. He's kind of like one of these characters, and there's he's sort of this lowlife from the 1950s, never had a chance, always trying to work an angle and sort of always screwing up. He just reminded me of the character in The Postman Always Rings Twice. He's this sort of like drifter going around, never holds down a job. And then he comes up with this idea of like why not sign up, to join the revolution and become a guerrilla? And he's on a shrimp boat in the Florida Keys, and he suddenly decides, he hears that a friend of his was murdered by the secret police in Havana, and he decides to go and reinvent himself over in Cuba. So he's got this sort of Gatsby-like aura around him that's kind of a comical version, sort of a low-life version of Gatsby. Yeah, the research was so bizarre. These little tips, these little pieces of information that you can find about him. And then I started, because he had been put on trial, when he was arrested by the immigration authorities and they tried to deport him, and he became this sensational national case. He's denounced by Robert Kennedy, on the front page of the New York Times. He's like defended by the ACLU. And so I went back and was able to, with the Freedom of Information and to get a hold of, the court testimonies. And then I went to the ACLU archive, which is in Princeton. So a day trip to go there, and they've got this massive file on this, because he went through various cases. It was in New York. It ended up in the Supreme Court. So they had this sort of cache of stuff, and from that, I was able to get the trial testimony in New York State, the appeals, and then embedded in all of that is this incredible amount of correspondence. And he's in court. They're quizzing him all about his life. His criminal record was there. His the psychiatric assessment done when he was like 15 or 16 is there. All this amazing stuff. It's and it's kind of fascinating. I mean, it was fascinating to me because a lot of it, after I went to the ACLU files, before the pandemic, which is to show how long it took for me to dig all this stuff up. But there's a lot of other stuff I was able to just like make these sort of requests. Eventually, the Immigration Service, which is now has an archive run by the Homeland Security, they sent me 2,700 pages of documents scanned, wow. And I'm like, Jesus, I'm not, this is going to take me a month to go through this. But it was like there's that, and the trial transcripts were able to be sent over. So there's an extraordinary amount of stuff. The FBI, there was some stuff that was embedded, in the INS thing about the FBI, but there's, even they were kind of helpful. I mean, back and forth about information. It was just kind of exciting. But I never would have had the time to do it if it wasn't for the pandemic, because it was kind of like, it was my little project. It's sort of to do one of these, requests it's like all day, and it's like, figuring out how to do it online. I was like, mind-boggling. And you always screw it up. And they're like, oh, no, you can't do that. You've got to do it this way. You're like, okay. The bureaucracy is incredible. And they keep turning you down. But then you sort of go, actually, what I meant was this. What I meant was that. And then, if you've got the patience to do it, it sort of works.
Were those the way you worded your FOIA requests? Is that what one of the mistakes you're referring to?
Oh no, there was even worse. That's right. It was one of them. Because there's turns out to be two Hermann Friedrich Marxes. You have to prove either that you have to have the date of birth, but also you have to have proof of death, for privacy issues to get a hold of their file. And my Hermann Marx disappeared. He just sort of he from Milwaukee, he's got into his car one day and drove off in like 1968, and no one actually knows what happened to him. So it's kind of like, oh, bummer. And but he was born in August 1921. So it's kind of like, okay. But when I made the request, it wasn't quite 100 years. But there was another Hermann Friedrich Marx who died in Miami. And I've got a photo of, online, you get a photo of his tombstone. And so I sent that to them. And it was like, they were like, okay, that's fine. And, it's stuff like that. But I was able to get his social security number. All this sort of weird stuff. His draft card is online somewhere. It's kind of like, so that's how I was able to show this olive skin, this swarthy complexion. But it turns out he appears in so many weird recollections, because he was kind of famous in his time, and early in, after the revolution, Newsday in 1959, when like the dictator flees. Anyone who's seen Godfather Part 2 knows this sort of amazing scene where, the dictator flies off and suddenly everyone panics and leaves Havana. And then 8 days later, Fidel turns up with the guerrillas. But it's this very sort of, it's often referred to as the honeymoon of the revolution, because everyone loved it in America. So all these journalists fly down, Hemingway's there, writers like George Plimpton, the editor of the Paris Review, go down. Tennessee Williams turns up, and there's this amazing meeting, which I start the story in April, where they all gather at El Floridita bar, this famous bar, and Hemingway's favorite bar. And one night they're all hanging out with Hemingway, and then the next night they're all meant to meet Hemingway, but he doesn't turn up. But instead, Herman Marx turns up and invites them to an execution. So everyone who was there writes a different account about this sort of night. And it's also, you sort of piece it together, and they're all like invited off to see an execution. And it turns out that was like a tourist attraction. He was like inviting people, everyone wanted to go see an execution. If you went to Havana, you'd go to a nightclub, you go to the Tropicana, you go see an execution. That was kind of like the thing to do if you were going to go to the revolution. So it was kind of this fascinating thing. So they all write about it, and they said they have descriptions of him. And it turns out in the press, all the journalists wanted to meet him. Once they discovered that an American was running, the executions, it was like awesome. The senators going down. They had the Hollywood actor Errol Flynn. He was there. And there's all these marvelous accounts. So you sort of piece it together. And Norman Lewis was an English journalist, very beautiful writer and great novelist as well. He went down like a buddy of Ian Fleming's, James Bond, author. He goes down there and hangs out and writes these beautiful sort of accounts of meeting, Herman Marx and going to the trials, and these are wonderfully evocative sort of things. It's kind of like there is actually a mine of information if you've got like 4 months and nothing better to do, sitting around in your apartment in New York.
Yeah, give us a sense of what his interactions were with the literary class in Cuba.
Yeah, the great one is where like George Plimpton and Tennessee Williams and Kenneth Tynan, who was the theater critic for the New Yorker, and his wife Elaine Dundee, who was this very successful novelist. They're all hanging around. So he just sort of turned up and introduced himself, and they were sort of intrigued. But he's sort of a redneck. He's like it's kind of funny that Tennessee Williams and has a streetcar named Desire. He has this Stanley Kowalski. This is like Stanley Kowalski turning up. Because he's like this Polish American dude who's like this sort of he can't he's and he's semi-literate, but he's sort of kind of this extraordinary character. He has this aura of danger and excitement. He'd been very successful as a guerrilla, and in fact had helped Che run the training up there, because a lot of the volunteers had never fired a gun, or they'd turn up with some carbine, from the 19th century. And so Herman was up there actually training them in various tactics and how to use guns and whatever. So he sort of was quite successful, even though he was a bizarre figure. And so people were sort of fascinated by him, but there's a sort of a snobby sort of thing. He's he's kind of a lowlife. So they're often, this sort of slightly snide references to the way he talks, the way he dresses. He's like dressing like a tourist. He's sort of, with this giant hulking gun, and often a little bit mocking, and yet sort of fascinated. This sort of aura of danger. Tennessee Williams even confesses that he'd sort of always fantasized about, being kidnapped by the rebels and spending a raunchy weekend up in, with Fidel and Che up in the mountains. So there was a sort of fascination. So with Herman, it was like, they were very wary of him, and he had sort of like also this aura of danger and this reputation for sadism as well. These rumors went round because he always had to do the coup de grace, the final bullet in the head to make sure that someone was dead after they'd been shot. And there were rumors that he would empty his cartridge into the guy's head, or even into the face, so they couldn't be recognized as a sort of a brutal, ruthless sort of sinister sort of last act. So there were all these stories that surrounded him, and Errol Flynn was particularly fascinated by that. He was like, Errol was like a great writer and a philosopher in many ways, weirdly. And so he met Herman Marx at a party, in Havana, and then invites him around for dinner in his hotel suite, where he's there with his, Errol's there with a 16-year-old Beverly Ardland, ingenue sort of actress. And so they have dinner together, and they're discussing, whether the philosophical aspects of execution and the death penalty, and whether the condemned man should be able to choose the manner of death, things like that. So it's kind of fascinating and bizarre.
Now, I understand that the beginning was something that you and Jonah really not wrestled with in a way that you tried multiple beginnings before settling on this more or less salon of the writers around Herman Marx. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you basically kind of workshopped a few beginnings, and then settled on the one that leads off this piece.
Yeah, well, the original piece that I did was quite long. It was something of an epic, and it was a sort of a ruminative start where I was sort of setting the scene in Havana, really, in a weird way, in spring, because the Floridita was this extraordinary place where Hemingway sort of presided, and it became the Rick's Cafe in Casablanca, where the arms dealers, the CIA agents, and the British Secret Service was there. The musicians, actors, they were shooting Our Man in Havana, in that month, and it was like everyone wanted to be in this one place. It was like like Berlin in the 90s, or Shanghai in the 30s, or Paris in the 20s. Everyone wanted to be in Havana, and I just found this sort of fascinating. And everyone in particular wanted to be in this bar, and that's where Hemingway meets Tennessee Williams in this very famous sort of meeting and this famous encounter. And it's kind of hilarious, these two literary lions, and everyone's there. And so I sort of started with that. But it was the next night that they all turned up, so it was a sort of double thing. And it was like, so it sort of took a long time to get to the meeting where Herman Marx turns up, because the next night they all turn up thinking that Hemingway's going to be there, and instead this other guy from the Midwest turns up. This sort of bizarre figure who weirdly was born like 70 miles away from where Hemingway was born, up on the lakes up there. Very strange sort of coincidences. And then I thought, that's taking too long to get to this meeting. And so then I thought, well, another one was like, what about where Errol Flynn meets Herman Marx? Because when he invites him around to dinner and has this amazing sort of conversation, it's quite bizarre, to have this sort of Hollywood, matinee idol. He's not as well remembered now, but he was like one of the gods of Hollywood, and who played Robin Hood, he played pirates, this very heroic sort of figure who had actually been in Cuba for many months and reported with Fidel on the front lines and in the east of the island, and was there the day. He was the only reporter who was there when Batista, the dictator, fled. So he wrote for this thing, the New York Journal American, another publication that no longer exists, but. So there was that extraordinary thing, and that this sort of weird conversation that they were having that was a possibility. God, I think we tried a couple of others as well, but Jonah very correctly said, "Why don't we just go with that meeting where Herman Marx turns up, and then all these guys are there, and like this invitation to go to the execution, and we get cut to the chase. We're meeting this extraordinary character. The very idea that there's an American who's running the execution is the most controversial element. To this day, the executions, the number of executions, is still argued and debated, and it's still a very controversial thing. So why don't we just start? Get straight into it, hit its stride. And I think it was the right decision. It was clearly the right decision. It was like, let's get right into it. And suddenly the narrative just kicks off from there.
Yeah, and you alluded to it earlier in that how Marx, after he flees Cuba, he's arrested in the States, and he had his citizenship stripped because he fought in a foreign army. But this turns out to be a giant civil rights case, because anyone who might have not been born in the States, who had fought in an army and came over and was naturalized, might be subject to deportation and everything. So suddenly Marx, as much of a monster as he is, becomes this token of, actually, we need to protect this guy for the good of the country.
Yeah, he's American history's least lovable civil rights martyr. He's and the irony, I mean, the ACLU was basically born to defend after the Red Scare in the First World War. It was like where the U.S. government would use stripping of citizenship as a weapon, as a political weapon. So in the First World War, against communists, anarchists, anyone with radical leanings, they would sort of be targeted. And it was very easy to target immigrants, because just say they came into the country illegally. In the case of Emma Goldman, the most famous, she was an American citizen, but all they had to do was go, oh, we actually gave you the citizenship by accident. It's like it was a mistake, and so deport her back to Russia. So it was used in the First World War at various times, and it became more and more, bizarre laws. There was one, that if a woman marries, and it was women, if you marry a non-American and go live overseas for 3 years, you lose your citizenship. All these weird rules, but there were ones that could really be used to target people. And one of them originated in 1940, but was sort of revived in particular during the McCarthy years, and that was which is the second Red Scare. So they're always targeting, unpopular, radicals. Was if you'd served in the Foreign Army, which is totally bizarre, given that in the First World War, so many Americans served in the British and French side before entering the war. In the Second World War, there's the Spanish Civil War, all these different occasions, and they talk about the Marquis de Lafayette in the American War of Independence. There's all sorts of extraordinary examples. So, but because of Cuba, and obviously this sort of romantic view of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, after the early days of Castro winning, to the point where Castro came to the United States in 1959, in April, and did this triumphant tour where he's like feted all over New York and Washington. He's carried on his shoulders around, and he's compared to George Washington as this whole extraordinary sort of thing, this incredible popularity. But that sours in 1959, and then by 1960-61, he's demonized, and so anything to do with Cuba is suddenly like toxic. So these Americans who were sort of serving in the military after the revolution, they're targeted one by one, and they're stripped of their citizenship. And so the ACLU realizes that this is a precedent that could really be used, against. In various ways against people. And the idea is that citizenship is a right. It's not something that the government can grant and take away. It's something that you're born in the United States, or you become a citizen. That's your right. You can't, it just can't be at the whim of the government under various laws. It's part of the 14th Amendment. So that was what the argument was. And it seems a very particular and bizarre case, and it sort of was in some ways, but the ACLU realized that it could really be abused, and they sort of pounced on it. And they were able to defend Marx in various cases. This crusading lawyer, Gordon Murray, joined up, and working pro bono, and really like this extraordinary character, and fights, all the way to the Supreme Court. And eventually, it didn't really help Herman Marx, but a year or two later, it was the Supreme Court did overturn all these cases and made it unconstitutional to try and strip away citizenship, and it was such a complete victory that today, telling people that you could lose your citizenship, if you married the wrong person, or if you did any number of like weird things, and people wouldn't, Americans don't really believe it. It's like the idea that citizenship rights were ever really at risk is sort of fantastical, and yet it was in the 60s, and so kind of an extraordinary moment.
How did you go about winnowing a lot of the legal stuff down? Because I imagine it was a wealth of information, and yet you don't want to weigh the narrative down too much with courtroom stuff. Yeah,
it's kind of mind-boggling to when you're first reading it, you're like, what? It's like, okay. And it went through, so many different appeals, and there were two elements to Marx's case as well, which was very confusing. First, the idea that he was stripped of his citizenship in Cuba, so he entered the United States illegally, and then when he's in the United States, they're deporting him because of moral turpitude, because he had a carnal, his criminal record, including a carnal knowledge case, when he in 1951. So there's all there's two sort of weird things going on. There's the constitutional case, and then there's this sort of like immigration case, and so. Luckily, there was a book written about it that's actually quite good by the Sovereign Citizen, that I found, and it's this whole book on this very issue, written by a Yale visiting professor, and it's actually very clear and very lucid. And so reading that, it sums up everything in such a sort of concise sort of way. It's like, okay, I get this, and it's true that like if I tried to put it all in, it would have been of interest only to legal scholars, So trying to clarify that sort of thing. I mean, that's hopefully we did it. And then, of course, the fact checkers were like, we were back and forth about how do you say this and like, get the legal terminology right, but still, sort of that the layman can sort of figure out. So I hope it worked. I think it sort of all makes sense, but it's definitely, it was definitely a challenge.
Yeah, and the structure is 5 parts with a short epilogue. So when you were setting down to write this piece, what was the machinations of coming up with the right structure to tell this story?
It had a very cinematic sort of element to it. It seemed to me,
yeah.
And and just starting at this moment where like. Where Herman Marx doing it, like running the executions, and him, and I liked the idea of. It coincided with like the honeymoon of the revolution, where everyone loves the revolution. It's very exciting, and Herman Marx is at his it's his golden moment where he's sort of he's respected. He's like everyone loves him in Havana because he's doing this. He's doing the. It seems like dirty work, but he's executing these guys. Like they're like Nazis. These guys, it's like they're really sinister figures, and so there's no sympathy. And in fact, for the long years of the dictatorship. There's the secret police have been running around, kidnapping people, torturing them, bodies being strung up in the streets, and like Cubans have been living for this like 7 years. So he's doing, and they do have these sort of trials, and lawyers can, there were revolutionary tribunals, but still there was evidence back and forth, and he's the one who's doing it. So he's sort of a beloved figure in Havana. He goes to the restaurants, he gets the best tables, everyone knows him, Captain Herman. He's like, yeah. And he starts dating this, Manhattan model who's his photojournalist there, and, Jean Secon and Jean Secon. And she's sort of like, so he's got this sort of like moment in the sun. So it's like starting with that, and then sort of like pulling back to his sort of bizarre earlier life. And then suddenly like, the narrative is like, oh wow. Then the narrative has its own sort of logic, but it is very cinematic. It's like consciously or unconsciously, you've got this amazing scene, and then stepping back, and then the narrative going along, and then this other turning point where like the revolution goes awry, and this conflict between the United States and Cuba suddenly becomes more and more extreme. And Herman Marx, as well as Jean Secon and these other Americans who were there, suddenly caught in this geopolitical machine where it's like becoming more and more extreme, and suddenly their dream lives in Havana, where they're like having this great time in the revolution, suddenly it's going very, very wrong, and they're like they're about they're in danger of being like arrested and tried as spies and this whole thing, and so. They come to the conclusion that get out of here as soon as we can. And but how do you get out of an island where the government, it would see Herman Marx as a deserter, and Jean Secon had been doing this sort of research on communism, all this sort of weird stuff. So they end up hijacking a boat, and then running out of petrol halfway to Mexico. It's kind of like, it was this amazing adventure story. And then the next stage, where there's the midnight door knock in a walk-up apartment in Manhattan, and the INS tracks him down and arrests him, and he becomes this sort of national figure. It's like he couldn't make it up. So it's kind of like that was the narrative, and it was like, and the only thing that I wish that I could have found out is like what happened to the guy, because he literally and he's like there, and everything's sort of screwed up for him. He and he manages to alienate everyone from sympathy. He's like, he gets arrested, he falls out of a tree, spying on some woman, in the Upper East Side, and breaks his leg, goes home to Milwaukee, lives with his mum, and then gets accused of child molestation. It's like, oh my God, it's like Herman, it's like, it wasn't very Hollywood friendly, I got to say. It was like, oh God, the charges may have been trumped up, we don't know. There's a whole weird romantic thing that it was going on with the woman who accused him. It was like, who knows? But then it's just not ideal. And then he's sort of like, he's about to be charged, so he just gets in his car and drives off. And no one knows what happens. His mother, when she's dying some years later, puts out a plea, in the newspapers to get, come back, Herman. The Salvation Army's looking for him in Skid Row in Chicago. See if he's on Alco there. The FBI has reports that, there's one report that he went back to Cuba and was shot. That's sort of fanciful because he would never have gone back to Cuba. It would have been insane. It was like, it would have been suicide. There was a report that he was in Canada. That turns out to be, they got the wrong person. The family thought that he'd fled to Mexico, which is by far the most logical thing, because in those days, I mean, he crossed over from Mexico by using his, Wisconsin driver's license that was out of date. And the Border Patrol guy didn't even ask him for it. He just said he had a driver's license in his pocket. So in those days, going back and forth to Mexico and disappearing in Mexico is, was very, very easy. I mean, he could have done it within the United States as well. In the 60s, it's hard to imagine how, or to remember, to realize how easy it was to disappear as compared to now. So in Mexico, could have just gone back and reinvented himself, as some American dude and just sort of like, dissolved into the landscape there. And, but I was trying to get the CIA files. That was the thing. That kind of really bummed me out. And the CIA just wouldn't do it. And then I tried everything. Public interest, whatever. And there's a clause that there's this national security clause that in fact I believe the Biden administration won't release. Reaffirmed last week that they won't release some JFK assassination documents on this sort of national security clause. And it's, I have a friend who actually works in the freedom of information sort of field. And he's like, no, you're never going to get it. It's never going to happen. They just, anything to do with Cuba during the revolution, they're just like, there's no way of forcing the CIA to reveal this file, which is unfortunate because it means that conspiracy theorists, because Herman Marx did in fact contact the CIA when he got back to the United States to say like, I have all this information. I was, personal contact with Che Guevara and Fidel, and, I know who everyone is and where they live, and it was never followed up apparently. But, conspiracy theorists would assume, that like if the CIA is not revealing the files, there's a reason for that, that maybe he signed up with the CIA and, was got a, witness protection thing and, was just like working as an agent for the CIA. We'll never know. It seems kind of unlikely given he was such a loose cannon, but it's possible.
Yeah. A low-life Gatsby probably wouldn't be able to be an unassuming figure throughout the rest of his life.
I mean, the CIA dealt with some pretty strange people. It's like if you look at who they were dealing with, especially with Cuba. But I did actually, when I was doing a story on the Bay of Pigs invasion for the 60th anniversary for Smithsonian, so I went down to Miami and I met, the surviving, Bay of Pigs veterans who like they have two museums down there, like they're all in their 80s and 90s, but they're like lucid and like they all get together for these anniversaries. In fact, I went to an open casket funeral for one of the guys, and they were all there hanging out. And then and I asked them all, and they're like, and in fact, Felix Rodriguez, who was the guy who was the CIA's major point man, is still alive, and he was the guy who helped track down Che Guevara in Bolivia in '67, and flew back with Che Guevara's body to La Paz. All this. So he's the guy. He said no, he never had any contact with him in the United States, and he said that if we had, sort of like just implied that that it would not have ended well for Herman because he was working for Castro. He was like doing the executions and the whole thing. So unfortunately for Marx, he was like hated by everybody. It was like, he fled the Batista people hated him because, he was executing their members. He fled the Castro revolution. So all he was considered a turncoat. The FBI wanted him, they hated him. The immigration people wanted to arrest him. So it was like everyone hated him. And, I thought there was kind of like an existential level to it, if you can have any sympathy for him, because he was the ultimate outsider when he was growing up. It's sort of a reforms. He was just in and out of one problem after the next from as a teenager, and kept couldn't hold down a job, and like a real sort of. He was a problem. He's like, drifting around the United States, was unable to, this amazing moment of prosperity in the States, and on the surface, it's this sort of, very extraordinary middle-class lifestyle that's building all over the United States. But there's also this underclass, of like, who just can't make it in the, in this sudden burst of wealth that's happening. And so, there's a sort of this poignancy, I thought, that he goes over to Cuba and sort of he joins the revolution. He reinvents himself. No one knows who he is. It's like, and he's able to use his weird skills in the Sierra Maestra, and sort of like, he's got to do this job. It's no one really wants to run execution squads, but he'll do it. And he sort of becomes this respected figure. And then, like, it's within a couple of years, he's beyond the ultimate outsider. It's like everyone wants to get rid of him. The U.S. government's against him, the Cubans are against him. No country, he becomes a stateless figure because he loses his citizenship, and yet no country wants to take him. It's kind of like the Mexicans refuse to have him, the Cubans refuse to have him. Everyone hates him. So he's wandering around the United States. He can't get a job. His Teamster union, card is revoked because the INS contacts the Teamsters union and tells him about his criminal past. So he loses his job there, and so he ends up working in his cousin's, hairstyling salon in Milwaukee. It's like, it's just he's even worse position than he was when he was growing up. So if there's any sympathy to be had for this guy, that's sort of it, I think.
Well, it's an incredible story, Tony, and I got to commend you on the pacing and everything about it, because it was a real gripping read. So, thanks for the work you did on it, and of course, thanks for the time to hop on the podcast to talk all about it.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. I can talk for hours about all this. It's I don't know. With Cuba, you get sort of fascinated, you get sort of obsessed, and you sort of lose perspective. But I just thought this was such a great untold story, and kudos to the Atavists. They really let me run with it. They saw the potential.
All right. Thanks to Jonah and Tony for the time, but more importantly, thank you for listening and hanging around for the after party. See, after the interview, it's not just credits. See, a lot of times people will front load their podcast with a whole lot of BS. Granted, I have a little bit of BS up there, but I tend to get in the interview pretty quick. But I save a lot of that BS for the post credits. I don't think anyone listens to it, but it's there if you want. In any case, this is the behind the velvet rope portion of the podcast. Price of admittance is your time, if you care. If you're loading the dishwasher, walking the dog, or ignoring your kids, I'm here for you. Grab a beverage. I'm sipping on anti-libations these days, part of a sober October, possibly longer thing, because I drink way too much and I'm out of shape and look like Shrek without the self-assuredness. And I figure if I can focus on just one freaking thing for 6 months, say my health and wellness and mobility and strength, then maybe I can set a new baseline from which to work and play from. I got this kind of thing going on with my left knee. I don't know if it's a mobility thing or something more structurally damaged. I keep wrenching my back during back and front squats. Again, don't know if that's just a muscle pull or something more structurally damaged. Gonna see a doctor about this, finally. And get this, the other day, my dog got stung by a bee. And while we were hiking, freaked out. Who wouldn't? I mean, getting stung by a bee sucks. And we didn't know how he would react. We just knew that it was really bugging him. And so that was effectively the end of the hike. But we were 3 miles from our car. I was forced to run with a pack to the car, and it did not go well. The whole time I got to thinking that fitness shouldn't be about vanity, though Instagram and men's health and women's health magazines and their airbrushed, roided up cover models would have us think otherwise. Fitness is about being useful. Like, what if you have to carry someone several miles? What if your dog got bit by a snake and not a bee, and you had to carry all 75 pounds of Hank 3 miles to a car? What if your cute neighbor needs you to move that heavy thing? What if you can unload all the groceries in one trip for your partner? And shouldn't you be able to hold your arm out straight while your kids do pull-ups on them without fear of your rotator cuff exploding? So as I ran as fast as I could over hills and stuff and hiking boots and a pack and hiking pants, a sweatshirt, taking 40 fucking minutes to run 3 miles, I got to thinking that I need to make some changes. And that probably means not drinking so goddamn much Oregon Delicious Frothy Hoppy High ABV IPA. And oh my God, do I have a problem or am I just bored? So there you are. I'm happy you stuck around. Are you happy you stuck around? I don't know. Magazine.atavist.com. Dig it. Stay wild, CNFers. And remember, if you can't do, interview. See ya.